Hi, Life Group leaders. I'm Ken Gaines, and I'm going to bring you this week's lesson. Hope everyone's doing well. We got a great lesson this week. It comes out of John chapter 2. It's entitled, I Will Raise. And it's a story that a lot of us are pretty familiar with. The lesson text is John 2:11 through 23 for the verses. The first part of chapter 2, we see Jesus performing his first miracle by turning water into wine at a wedding. And because of this sign, Jesus' glory was manifested. The disciples believed in him, the Bible tells us, and this was the purpose of that miracle. And so for our lesson today, we get into this next event that John records here, and it happens at Passover. This story has been visualized in children's books and movies, and paintings, and various other media. One of the overriding questions is how angry was Jesus really? And, how did this really unfold? Is it as it's been portrayed, or were there some differences there? And so it's important to remember as we go through this why John wrote about this event and why he wrote his entire gospel. And we find that in John 20:31. So we'll continually refer to that as we go through this lesson. And in John 20:31, he tells us that he wrote this gospel so that the reader may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the true Son of God, through which we can have everlasting life. And so that's the general theme so that's the focus that John comes from as he relays all of these events of Jesus' life. You probably don't have time in class, but an interesting side study is the timing of this event. So John records this happening very early in Jesus' ministry, right? Or so it appears. So Jesus has called his disciples. He's had his first miracle, so he started his ministry. And then we have this event here. Whereas the other Gospels record this in the very last week of Jesus' life as he comes back into Jerusalem before he's crucified and resurrected. One theory is that Jesus cleansed the temple at two different times. Here at the beginning of his ministry, and then again in the last week that he was alive, as the other Gospels recorded. The other theory is that John simply stated this event out of chronological sequence to make his point that Jesus has authority from God the Father. But either way, again, John's point in relaying this event goes back to John 20:31 to show that Jesus is the Christ, and that if we believe in him, we have everlasting life. So we just need to keep that forefront of our thoughts. But that is an interesting discussion. I've listened to various preachers preach it two different ways, and so it's interesting to think about. Temple worship. So to understand Jesus' actions in the temple in the next set of verses, we need to look at the Old Testament to see some of the rules God set up for worship at the temple. And a lot of this is in Exodus, so if you read through Exodus, chapters 13 and 20 are real good if you don't want to read the whole book. But we find that Passover was instituted by God. And he later mandated that they observe it every year. There's the census tax of half a shekel that had to be paid, and it could not be paid in foreign currency. And also a sacrifice had to be made, and that sacrifice had to be unblemished. And so we can start to see, why some of these things were happening in the temple with the number of people that were coming into Jerusalem for the Passover feast. It's estimated that the city's population would quadruple during this time. So you can imagine what kind of chaos that would create. And so some of these people would come from very far away also. And they didn't have modern transportation, so it'd be very difficult to arrive with an animal from a long distance that would be acceptable. And so, and many of these people came from other lands. They had different kinds of money. So if money had to be exchanged, and it's logical that you buy your sacrificial animal there in Jerusalem, what was Jesus so upset about? Well, we get some insight from John, but we also get some insight from some of the other Gospels as well. In their accounts, Jesus called the traders thieves or robbers. And so that indictment tends to lead us to believe that they were charging high fees for the exchange of the money, which they should not have been doing. As a matter of fact, Moses' law has rules about what kind of interest you can charge for loans and for the exchange of money, particularly between Jews and other Jews. Also, this business was being conducted inside the temple. And so that's a key point here. Now, Jesus, we can assume, had been to Passover every year of his life because he was a Jew and he followed Jewish law. We know that. He pointed to that several times throughout the New Testament. So either this was the first time they had moved all of this business inside the temple, or this was simply the time Jesus chose to make his authority known. Either way, though, by them doing this inside the temple walls, the high priest would have been at fault for allowing such activity inside the place designed by God himself as a house of prayer. And the only reason he would do this likely is because there was some benefit to himself. He was probably getting kickbacks for this. There would have been no logical other reason why he would allow this to be going on inside the temple compound. Now, they were in the court of the Gentiles, but again, this was the only place that non-Jews were allowed to go and pray. So if they were believers, this was the only place where they could worship and conduct their Passover ceremonies. And here were all these people in here with all these animals, which you can imagine what kind of noise, smell, and other things that would create. All of this money exchange going on. People probably going to one money exchanger and saying, I don't like that rate, I'm going to go to this guy over here. And so all of this was happening inside the temple. And so that way we can start to see now what Jesus was really upset about. He wasn't upset that they were doing these things, because these things were probably necessary to conduct the Passover, simply because of the massive number of people that were coming through and the conditions in which Passover needed to be observed. It was not what they were doing, it was how they were doing it. And again, that's always so key, we find in the Bible, is how things are being conducted, And so the other interesting thing about this is the traders were obviously taken aback by this action. And this was definitely a divine intervention, or you could even call it a miracle. Because Jesus comes in, it says he creates this whip of cords. He's turning tables over. He's causing a huge ruckus. And so this was these people's livelihood. They would not have taken to this lightly, The obvious outcome of this should have been someone jumps up, pops Jesus in the mouth, and then directly after that, the temple guard, who would have been there en masse because of the number of people, would have tackled him to the ground, arrested him, taken him out, and said, "What are you doing?" None of that happened. And we know why. God's directing all of this. But that's a key point, that this is not a logical outcome of what Jesus was doing. Driving animals out, driving people out, flipping tables over, that would not have resulted in the people just stepping back and then asking him a question. But that's exactly what happened. And the reason it happened that way is because of the purpose of Jesus doing this. And we'll get to that in just a second. So Jesus does this, and the people demand that he show the authority, because he said this was his Father's house. And they said, "Well, what authority do you have to say this is your Father's house?" Jesus responds to them with a parable. So an interesting thing to talk to your class about is, why did Jesus respond to the question with a parable instead of just answering them in a straightforward answer? And part of the answer lies in verse 22. He said what he said. He used the metaphor he used so that his disciples would benefit from that later at his death. They would remember him saying this, and it would help them as they struggle through that hard time. And also, he answered this way in a way that only believers would understand. And in verse 23, it says that several believed in him as the Son of God. And so, again, John, as he records this event, which is a little different, there's a lot of similarities and some differences in the way John records this versus the other Gospels. He stays true to his purpose in writing his Gospel. And that's why the details he puts in and the details he leaves out in his recording of the events are there so that the reader will believe in Jesus as the Christ. And so it all points to that, and hopefully that's what your class gets out of the discussion this Sunday. Again, there's lots of things to talk about in here, lots of what ifs, some unanswered questions, but the overriding theme is, why did Jesus do this, and what was the point of recording this? And the point of that was to show that he had authority as the Son of God. God was his Father, and he was the Holy One that was the Messiah. And that was the whole point of this. It wasn't to, again, it doesn't say that Jesus attacked anyone, he didn't hurt anyone, but he made it very clear that they were not observing the intention that God had put before them for the temple or for the Passover itself. And the reason he was upset about it was because he would eventually become the Passover lamb for all of us. And so that was the point of trying to get everyone to understand that. And then how important that was. I mean, it's our eternal life, right? So, again, point to John 20:31 several times. That's why John wrote this and everything else he put in his gospel. And if we focus on that, then it all makes a lot of sense, and we really don't need anything else other than that. So look forward to the discussion this week in my class, and I know you guys will have the same in yours. And so I hope you have a good rest of the week, and I'll see you Sunday.